The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Our prisons are bursting at the seams.
There are fewer than 250 places left in men's prisons in England and Wales.
Governors are being told to send inmates home 2 months early to free up cells.
We have the largest prison population per head in Western Europe.
And it costs us £48,000 a year to keep them there, a fraction short of what it costs to be at Eton.
And does it work? More than half of those serving short sentences re-offend.
So what is the answer?
How can we have a humane, just and effective system of dealing with those who break our laws?
Can we think of alternatives, or are we imprisoned by our own prison system?
The Y Curve.
So I think there's about 95,000 people in prison. Might be a bit higher than that.
85 was what I heard, but it may have gone up a bit.
Well, I've got 2023. And when are your figures from? But anyway, of that order. But
yes.
The interesting thing is there's been a big increase since 1990. Yeah. So it looks like the numbers have doubled, whereas the population at that time has only grown by about 20%. So what is going on?
We're all more criminal, clearly.
Well, but the thing is we're not, because you look at the crime survey estimates and it says basically crimes have halved since 1990.
Well,
so we're less crime, more people going to prison.
Yeah, a lot of it is to do with throwing kind of stuff towards certain part of the population politically. Prisons don't get votes, but putting people in prison or threatening to kind of does.
So it's populism.
Well, yeah, I think you could say that. The other thing is there was these famous indeterminate sentences which were brought in by Labour, New Labour, in the late 90s, where you go to prison, but there isn't actually an out time for you necessarily, depending on your behaviour,
right?
Which maybe sound like a good idea at the time, but what it means is there's a lot of people who've got no prospect of coming out at all.
Yeah,
ever.
So it's a crazy situation we're in, isn't it? And yet, you can look at the Nordic countries. How often do we look at the Nordic countries?
As often as we can.
They seem to be doing everything well, don't they?
I know.
So because if you look at the incarceration rate, so in the US, we know it's crazy.
US is mad. That's true.
So per 100,000, they've got 531. That basically means one in 200 people is in prison in the United States, which is just a staggering statistic. For us, it is we're about 1 in 700 compared to them. Yeah. But if so a lot less. But if you look at that rate of 531 per 100,000, in Norway it's 52, in Finland it's 52, even in Canada, which is just over the border from the United States.
You think?
88.
It is, yes.
Well, I think last time I looked on a map. So we just got one line, just a border there, and all of a sudden the incarceration rate drops from 531 to 88.
Yes.
So what's going on in the United States?
It is very strange, isn't it? I mean, is it to do with social attitudes?
It has to be.
But also, I mean, the point about prisons is, yes, okay, the numbers who are in and the numbers and the fact we haven't got enough prison buildings, but also, what on earth are we doing imprisoning that many people if it doesn't actually do
the job?
Much good. I mean, what's prison for? Obviously to punish in one sense, but also to take people off the street if they're dangerous, but also with a hope of rehabilitation. But the thing is, there's so little resources there that you don't actually, there's very little goes into actually giving people skills or trying to change the way they think or whatever it is to try and make sure they don't when they come out.
And it's very hard, isn't it, when government finances are so short, and they are only short because they don't want to spend the money, for them to say, well, okay, what do we do? Do we fix prisons, or do we fix potholes in the road? Where are people going to go? They're going to go, well, have you seen the state of the roads lately?
People are going to say, well, prison, it's a holiday camp. It's a holiday camp.
Exactly. Let's just make it worse for them. Exactly. So there's a lot of things going around here, but the ultimate conclusion is it's just not working.
It isn't working, and it's going to be very difficult, particularly in an election year, to do very much about it. The prisons minister has said, look, we've got to do something. We've got to let people out. I mean, that's slightly bizarre. Everybody gets 2 months off their sentence. That's not going to make much difference in some ways, I suppose. But the other problem is these short sentences, which probably don't do very much. Perhaps take people out of society for a very brief period, doesn't change their outlook, doesn't change very much, and over half the people on what they call short sentences reoffend. So it doesn't do anything at all.
Yeah, no,
and it costs a lot of money to put them there.
Yeah, exactly, and there's a lot of reoffenders, aren't they? So you begin to wonder whether people are reoffending because they're quite like the lifestyle, because it's a holiday camp, didn't you?
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's a lovely place to be. But anyway, let's hear from someone who really knows what they're talking about, and that's Mark Day. He's Deputy Director of of the Prison Reform Trust, and he joins us now.
So, Mark, just before we started talking to you, I was talking about, so the numbers don't seem to stack up in that we've now got, more people going into prison, more people incarcerated. Crime doesn't seem to be increasing. In fact, it seems to be decreasing. And the number of people, the prison population is increasing at a far greater rate than the population of the country as a whole. That doesn't seem to stack up, does it? What's happening here?
Well, there are a number of factors which are contributing to a rapidly rising prison population, which the latest projections suggest could get as high as 114,000 by March 2028.
114,000? We haven't got any space for that, have we?
Absolutely not. On current plans, there is simply no way that the Ministry of Justice could meet that increased demand.
So is it populism that's driving a lot of this? Just the fact that the media and politicians are using it to score points, to say, hey, look, we're getting tough on crime?
So what we've seen over the past 30 years is a rise by 93% in the prison population. So what is driving the growth is a combination of longer term factors and also more shorter medium term factors. So if we look at the longer term factors involved, there has been no doubt that we have seen a lengthening of sentences across the board during that time. And particularly, we have seen sentence inflation at the top end of sentencing. So that is the sentences passed for the most serious offences have increased quite markedly.
And is that judge's discretion or is it statutory?
This is statutory. So the primary thing that has been driving this growth has been changes in legislation. And then, yes, court judgments, particularly Court of Appeal judgments in relation to particular cases, would set general case law, and that can also have an impact. But it is often led by the statutory changes. So, for instance, if we look at the 2003 Criminal Justice Act, what happened there was we saw an increase in minimum tariffs for various forms of murder. And almost overnight, what we saw as a consequence of the passing of that legislation, we saw quite a rapid increase in the length of tariffs passed for those offences. So that had a direct impact on the length of time people were then serving.
But murder is a very small part of the crime area, isn't it? I mean, that couldn't be a determining factor right across the piece.
You need to think about the impact of long sentences on the prison population overall versus short sentences. So the thing about giving somebody a long sentence is what essentially you're doing is you're saying this person will be in your prison and will be a burden on your prison system for 20, 30 years. Whereas if you are passing a short sentence, which in terms of volume, much greater volume of shorter sentences passed than longer sentences. But say if you only have a sentence of 6 months, you're released in 3 months, automatic release at the halfway point. You represent much less of a burden in terms of the actual demand on a prison place compared to that person on the longer sentence. So even though as a proportion of overall sentences, these longer sentences are smaller as a proportion, they represent a much greater burden on the system. And that is why they have had such an impact in terms of driving overall demand on the prison system.
Right. And you'd assume longer prison sentences. I mean, obviously part of it is protecting society from those people that you don't want walking the streets. But it would be a disincentive for the crime. But
is that true?
Does it do that?
Well, one of the things we've criticised the government for in with regard to various changes it's made to the sentencing framework at this top end is the lack of evidence around what is being hoped to achieve by increasing lengths of sentences. Because if you look at the evidence around deterrence, there's actually relatively little convincing evidence that it actually works, except for a very small group of particular type of offender. For lots of offenders, sentencing as a deterrent doesn't really work.
Because when they commit the crime, in their mind is not, oh, I better not do this because I might go to prison for X number of years.
Well, if we look at murder, for instance, murder is often a crime of passion. So people will not be thinking rationally in those moments when the offence is committed. Around if I did this, will I receive a longer sentence than I might have done otherwise? So therefore, to make an argument around deterrence doesn't really work for that type of offence.
But it's not politically tenable, is it, to say we're going to reduce the sentence for murder? I mean, people want them to be locked up for as long as possible. But
politicians obviously feel that that they want to increase the length. So that there is a choice involved at that moment. And one of the consequences politicians are now having, they're reaping what they sow. For 30 years, they have been passing legislation which has imposed longer and longer sentences. The impact is now a prison population which is growing at an unsustainable rate. So politicians have a choice, and, we elect politicians to lead responsibly. And what we see...
Oh, you're so old-fashioned.
In terms of the overall governance of our system is irresponsibility in how it has been run.
Which is why my question about populism. So I before we started talking, I just flicked through a book called Penal Populism by John Pratt. I don't know if you're aware of it, but he basically argues that the media, including social media, is responsible for a lot of this because, it is painting this picture that crime is out of control, it needs to be cracked down on, and that is putting pressure, I guess, not on the judicial system. From your point earlier, it's putting pressure on the politicians to increase the sentences in legislation. And is that the root cause of all of this?
I think certainly the media plays its part in what may drive politicians to sort of legislate. I think another factor involved is sort of generally lack of public understanding of sentencing. And what is actually happening. And I think there's a bit of a perverse consequence here, because I think what happens when politicians say they are going to legislate to make sentences tougher, I think what the public probably hear is sentences aren't tough enough. So because what we do see from all the public opinion measures, over a number of decades, is public confidence in the system has not gone up. So, and often what politicians do is they justify increasing sentences on the grounds of public confidence. We are doing this in order to increase public confidence in the system. Well, what the evidence shows is that hasn't worked. So, clearly something's going wrong here. And, a definition of madness is to repeat the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. That's precisely what politicians have been doing. They have been lengthening sentences in the hope of public confidence increasing, and it's just stayed the same.
And they're not prepared, we talk about responsible governance, they're not, okay, if you accept, and I don't necessarily, that giving higher sentences has any kind of effect on deterrence or public confidence, but you have to then spend the money to build the prisons for the population that you've got. And people saying, oh, yes, we're going to increase sentences, maybe is popular, but people saying, I'm going to build X number of prisons with this amount of money instead of some hospitals or schools isn't popular. There's no logical... They're being illogical in that, aren't they?
Yeah, well, as Roger made the point earlier, just before we started talking to you, that, people are more likely to say, well, if it's more uncomfortable in prison, then that's a good thing. Why spend money on it?
I think that the prison system has been a victim of the fact that in many respects it is a hidden public service that people don't know much about, don't really understand what goes on in prisons. And so it has been treated like a political football, really. So, during the decade of austerity, the Ministry of Justice experienced particularly severe cuts. And that had a direct impact on conditions in prison, particularly with a really worrying drop in numbers of staff and subsequently a very, very worrying spike in violence in prisons and levels of self-harm as well. So certainly, that period, the Ministry of Justice took a large hit in terms of public spending. And again, I think what we see now is the prison system taking that hit from what you rightly say is a form of penal populism. It's very easy for politicians to promise increasing sentences. In many ways, it's the sort of out of the box solution to problems, even though, because it might play well in the media, where there's a lack of evidence often for it being an effective policy solution. But down the line, you will have consequences on the system in terms of the pressures on the prison population.
But you're right, it is hidden, isn't it? We have no idea what goes on, and apart from obviously that very accurate view that we got on Porridge years ago, and no one's got a clue what goes on. Well,
there have been some very popular dramas quite recently, actually, about life inside. How accurate they are, God only knows, but certainly actually quite illustrating some of these problems. And one of the things I wanted to pick up with you, Mark, is I was a prison visitor myself up until about 2012. And for a number of years. And I remember at that point, perhaps in the beginning of the period of austerity you're talking about, there was... We talk about people spending time in prison and the object of prison. We've already said that deterrence is perhaps marginal. But one of the ideas is that you reform people, that people change their ways of looking at things, that they become educated, whatever it is. And what was so noticeable in those last few years I was a prison visitor was the change, the lack of that provision, how it was just disappearing. Because I guess people weren't willing to spend the money to get in tuition or any kind of education or anything like that. I mean, has that been a trend?
It is extremely hard for prisons to do the work of rehabilitation when they are under such pressure as they are at the moment. I think as well, it's important here to talk about the impact of the pandemic and what happened to prisons during that period. Like every other sort of part of society during that time, prisons experienced lockdown with prisoners in their cells, 23 hours a day, very limited sort of access to sort of free association time, everything done on obviously because of the public health measures that needed to be in place. But then when we saw restrictions lift, whilst in the rest of the community, there was a fairly rapid change from a period of lockdown and people not being able to socialise, etc., to sort of going back to their normal lives. That didn't happen in prison. And the prison's inspectorate has become increasingly concerned and worried in the visits that it has conducted into prisons that prisoners have continued to experience what amounts to lockdown conditions, spending large chunks of their time locked up in their cells with little to do. Now, what we think has happened here is that during this period, we had quite a high turnover of staff as well. So lots of new staff coming in, and many staff who essentially grew up in a prison system which was under lockdown. So it was part of the culture that people spent long periods locked up in their cells, and that continued post the end of the pandemic. It's also, I think, a product of the pressures on the system in terms of staff retention. The prison system has had difficulties in, we have had an improvement in recruitment, but keeping those staff on has proved very difficult indeed. And then we have the pressures of overcrowding as well, all which means that simply as a way of managing your population, you are keeping people behind their cell doors rather than having them out, either in free association, engaged in purposeful activity, or in education or training.
So what are the consequences of that? Do you get increased violence as a result?
I think you can do. I mean, what we run an advice and information service for prisoners, and I have to say that we have never experienced such a level of concerns coming through to our service around safeguarding, around mental health, self-harm. The volume of difficulty and distress which is now in the population, I think is very worrying indeed. And I think this can be directly related to the pressures of overcrowding and the pressures of lack of staff, which we are currently seeing.
And presumably, as a result of this, any attempt at rehabilitation, whatever, or what might make it less likely that they will reoffend? Presuming that's come down. I mean, do we know in any detail what the reoffending rate is of people?
So I've got some figures here, which, I mean, they might be a little bit out of date. They're from Civitas, which is the Institute for the Study of Civil Society. Yeah. And they reckon 70% of custodial, it might be a couple of years out of date. In fact, this possibly predates the pandemic. 70% of custodial sentences are imposed on those with at least 7 previous convictions. 50% are imposed on those with at least 15 previous convictions. So if those numbers are right, that's a huge reoffend rate, isn't it? And it shows those people are not really thinking too hard about whether they're going to go to prison or not.
Yes, I mean, reoffending is a complicated area because it's actually a measure of reconviction, which therefore involves the police and police practice. And so it's, yes, you do often hear sort of politicians either trumpet a slight decrease in reoffending or political opponents talk about increases. The reality is first of all, reoffending is a kind of drag measure. You don't know what the reoffending rate is until 2 years down the line, because that's the point at which reoffending is measured. And secondly, there are so many factors involved in the measurement of that, which is a measurement of reconviction. So that's, the police having to pick up certain types of offenders and not others. So it's a slightly unreliable measure.
But in an ideal world, you'd have somebody goes to prison for something they did wrong. They go through a process. They realise they made a mistake. They don't do it again. We don't get any reoffenders. I mean, this utopian vision of the world I'd like to live in. But we're a long way from that.
Yeah. Again, I think we have to be sort of quite clear and objective about what does prison do in terms of increasing or decreasing the chances of someone reoffending. And what we do know around the evidence around reoffending is that there are protective factors involved in reducing someone's risk at reoffending. One of those is having a job. Another is having stable housing and accommodation, having good contact with family on the outside as well. And what we certainly know about prison is that it can actually make those things worse. People who can go to prison often lose housing and their jobs. It takes people out of their families. It can destroy family contact. So when people are released, they actually may be more likely to reoffend. And we certainly see that with the short sentenced population. So people who are sent to prison on short sentences have amongst the highest rates of reoffending compared to any other form of disposal. And indeed, the current Justice Secretary is trying to push through a change to legislation to create a presumption to suspend short sentences of 12 months or less. And this is on very good evidence.
It's not going to win him any votes, though, is it?
I'm here to talk about the evidence, and if politicians were to listen to the evidence, there would be very little ground for disputing this measure.
Yeah. So you think there's a lot of people on short sentences then who shouldn't be in prison at all, that if they didn't go to prison and there's some other way that they could be prosecuted, which would allow them to stay with their family and keep their jobs, and then they wouldn't reoffend. That would be the hope.
Well, that's what the evidence shows, and there's something called the community sentence treatment requirement, which is a form of community sentence, which essentially packages together a number of different types of disposal. So mental health treatment requirements, drug treatment requirements as well, And what we do know about this what is called the revolving door population, because as you said, high level of reconviction, and often in for sort of petty offences. A typical example would be sort of shoplifting. And what we do know about this population is it is often driven by addictions or mental ill health.
Mm. Do we get people going to prison for shoplifting?
You can potentially.
Yeah, less likely. What about the age profile in this, Mark? We haven't really talked about that. I mean, young offenders, it's one of those classic things where the suggestion is if people find themselves in confinement at young ages, one of the cliches is that you then basically preparing them for a life of crime of in and out. I mean, is the evidence that young offenders who are convicted and then spend time in prison or young offenders institutions, that they are more likely to reoffend or to be reconvicted?
One of the sort of hidden success stories of the criminal justice system in recent years has been quite a marked drop in the number of under 18s in custody. So whilst the adult population has been increasing, we have seen quite a significant drop in the level of youth custody. But in turn, that population itself has changed in its profile. So we are now seeing a lot larger proportion of the under 18 population being sent to prison to actually serve very long sentences. And also, unfortunately, another factor has been the higher rate of need amongst this population, often very complex levels of need in terms of mental health, levels of social exclusion, that sort of thing. So we have seen a significant change. And I think this has come about partly as a result of a consensus that prison for this group is particularly damaging. And what we also know from the evidence around reoffending is there's something called desistance and the desistance curve. And so levels of offending sort of peak in early adulthood, sort of rising through adolescence, through to early adulthood, and then fall. And so this is all more or less sort of independent of what you do to these people. You send them to prison, you put them on a course. There's still this sort of fairly persistent desistance curve where people do just, their offending tends to drop off as the older people get. So some sort of theorists and academics have argued that, what we need to do around, if you want to increase the chances of supporting the desistance curve, getting people not to reoffend, it's not to put barriers in the way of that desistance. And when you hear these cliches around colleges of crime, etc., around prison, there's some truth in that, because what you're doing is you are putting a young offender in an institution with loads of other young offenders, and you are socializing them towards the values of that group. What we should be doing is something else. We should be supporting them away from crime and away from offending.
Well, if you someone who's dealing in drugs, if you stick them in prison, they're likely to go, well, this is fantastic. All of a sudden, I've got a whole load of new customers, all in close proximity.
In theory, drugs aren't allowed in prisons, but
but we know it happens. But where do we draw the line then? If you're saying that incarceration by itself is not stopping people from reoffending. And so, if it's a low-level crime, really, what is the point? And you made the point that, in fact, if it's there's a chance that they are more likely to reoffend. So then that becomes, well, what's the role of prison? Then surely it is just to protect society. That's its main function. So does that is that the determining factor as to who goes to prison and who doesn't?
The people who should be off the streets, in effect, at least for a time.
Yeah, I mean, it's prison has to serve a number of different purposes, and it ultimately serves the courts and the decisions of the courts. And there are 5 purposes of sentencing: public protection, punishment is a part of sentencing, rehabilitation. I forget the others.
And the other two.
They're in that.
Right, but that punishment one is an important one, isn't it? Because you might say, for example, fraud is a victimless crime, and so should you go to prison for that? But there would be a lot of people who go, well, that would be, a lot of very powerful, rich people would go, that's the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. Bit of community service, happy with that. I'm still going to commit the crime. Whereas, the fear of going to prison would be a determining factor on whether they commit the crime or not, perhaps.
I mean, I think it's right that punishment is part of sentencing. We have a justice system to ensure that people get their just desserts. So, I think I would say that the purposes of sentencing, there is various debate about them and whether some are more effective than others in terms of, and how they are applied by the courts is often an issue of dispute too. But yes, punishment is a part of sentencing, and it's right that it is. I think my argument would be whether that part of sentencing has become disproportionate in terms of the amount of attention we give to it. What about the other parts of the purposes of sentencing as well? What about rehabilitation? And particularly if you look at something like a short sentence and the evidence we know around the poor outcomes of short sentences, is enough attention being given to the court when they pass such a sentence to the purpose of rehabilitation, or is it just about punishment for the sake of it?
Well, Mark, I mean, you're from the Prison Reform Trust. What would be the reformed system or the reforms in the system that you think would really work? I mean, initially, we've got a position, as you say, a crisis of a ballooning prison population. So immediately, should we change sentencing? Should we build more prisons? Should we improve the prisons we've got? What are the priorities?
I think the immediate priority has to be dealing with the capacity crisis, which we are currently facing. It is an immediate and pressing concern that is putting the lives of prisoners in danger and the lives of staff in danger too, and also means that if the government doesn't deal with it effectively, it could literally run out of prison spaces, and so the courts would not have anywhere to put people. So that is the most immediate and pressing concern which needs to be dealt with. Now, what Alex Chalk has introduced is a series of measures which will buy him some more time. He's introduced an early release scheme. There's also some legislation in train to introduce this presumption to suspend short sentences and to increase eligibility for something called home detention curfew, which is a form of early release on an electronic license. I would say those two measures are absolutely pressing priorities which have to be passed, because not doing so puts the system in immediate danger. So that's very much the kind of immediate concern, is to alleviate these pressures of population, to ensure that to the best that it is able to under current conditions, the system can hold people safely.
But that's a sticking plaster, essentially, isn't it, for the moment?
Yes, it is. I mean, we have a crisis, and when you're in a crisis, you have to deal with the immediate issues caused by the crisis. So that is work which absolutely has to be done and is essential. And reading the Times today and the reports of the political bun fight taking place over the sentencing bill, I just hold my head in my hands, really. Politicians need to behave responsibly in the face of a system which is in meltdown. So
the long-term view then, you've got to work on these things simultaneously, obviously fixing the short-term crisis. But do you think we need to revisit some of the legislation? Do we need to put more responsibility back on the courts when it comes to determining sentences?
Or build more prisons?
I think in the longer term, we need to face up to the legacy of these decades of penal populism and what it has done to our system. And I think what we need is a thorough cross-party look at the sentencing framework, and whether it is really delivering to those purposes of sentencing, which I mentioned earlier. Funnily enough, in the 2019 Conservative Manifesto, sort of hidden in the section on justice and home affairs, there was a commitment to establish a royal commission on the criminal justice system. That never saw the light of day, and we're now coming to the end of this parliamentary term. In my view, that was a missed opportunity. I think the state of our criminal justice system is absolutely right for some form of commission, which could examine the impact of our sentencing framework on demands on prisons, and also ask those questions about whether sentencing is really delivering in terms of the purposes, and whether our prison system is fit to meet those demands. I think that's what we need. We need a thorough, proper review of the system. Arguably, the last time that happened in relation to prisons was with the Wolf Report in the 90s after the riots which took place. We haven't really seen since then a kind of considered look at the system as a whole and whether it is functioning adequately.
So if that doesn't happen and penal populism continues, so long as the Murdoch press is around, What happens? When do we reach breaking point, and how does that
Do
materialize?
we get more riots?
I mean, I think there's a good argument to say that we're already at breaking point. You know, we have had, the system has been under emergency measures for over a year now, and you know, we are having to. There have been a number of changes which the Lord Chancellor has introduced to deal with the immediate pressures on the system. As I said, we have, you know, extremely worrying levels of self-harm in the system, worrying and rising levels of violence, problems of staff retention. You know, these are all flashing red lights on the dashboard of the prison system. So to say that, you know, I think we are already in that situation now. And we have a prison population which is projected to rise in a relatively short space of time. So sort of really staggering levels, you know, as I said, as high as 114,000 by 2028.
And what do you figure out now? We were arguing over this number. We thought it was somewhere like 95,000, something like that.
The current
population is about 88,000. So but if you think about it, that's a rise of 60.
Huge.
26,000 potentially. And you know, that's 3 prisons a year,
which are not being built.
No,
currently.
So the government has promised 20,000 places by I can never, you know, the date always seems to recede into the distance. I think it's 2030, but it's just not on track to build those numbers of places. So,
and more police on the streets, does that make the situation worse, or does that make any? I mean, you could argue both ways. The more police on the streets, then that's a deterrent to commit crime, or does it make just people feel more comfortable, or does it catch more, and therefore we need more people in prison? What's your take on that?
So one of the other factors, when I said at the beginning, one of the factors which had contributed to the rise in the prison population was the kind of growth in the length of sentences, particularly at the serious end. There's a couple of other factors as well involved. One is the rising numbers of police officers. So this is one of the factors which has led to the more immediate increase which we have seen in recent years. So there was a commitment to 20,000 additional police officers, I think, and indeed they have recruited more officers. Obviously, what happens when you do that is you see an increase in arrests and convictions and numbers coming before the courts. And obviously, a proportion of those people will go to prison. So,
you have to argue that's a good thing.
Well,
I mean, the fact that we don't want to have prison populations declining because more people are getting away with it. I mean, you know, that's not.
I mean, I suppose, you know, whether it's good or bad is irrelevant. Yeah. What you have to do is resource the impact.
Can we actually do it?
So it sounds like the only answer then is actually to invest more, build more hospitals, and then prisons, and then look at something else I'm not delivering on, and then look at the longer term picture about who exactly is going to prison.
Yes, I think it's a combination, really. So, you know, yes, number of arrests and convictions. You could argue it's a good thing in terms of meeting levels of crime in the community. But there is also a question of what do you do with someone once they are arrested and convicted? And certainly, you know, for those people who might get short sentences, I would argue there for many of that population, there are better disposals in the community. So that would be one thing. I think another important thing to say is, you know, there are also options for people even before they get to court in terms of out of court disposals. And indeed, the police do make use of those disposals, and that can involve the diversion of someone into treatment as well. So you know, just because you have more police officers and you're having more people therefore coming into contact with the criminal justice system, it's not an automatic pipeline into prison.
Then you get into it all shows it's a complicated question, because then you get into the question about whether the police are handling mental health issues, which is a whole other area with another discussion.
But Mark, as we draw this to a conclusion, I mean, we're going to have a change of government almost certainly. Do you think Labour, I mean, are you guys lobbying the potential incoming Labour government to try and do something rather different?
Well, we have regular contact across parties. So obviously with government ministers and also with the opposition as well. And yes, of course, we're a charity. We have a mission, and we seek to fulfill that mission through seeking to influence those who might have a handle on prison policy either now or at a later date. So yes, we are having those conversations. I mean, I think that what I would say is whichever government comes in the next election will face the same problem, which is a prison population projected to rise, very rapidly and significantly, and very little money and resource to hold that increase in numbers.
A problem that can't be ignored. Mark, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
So now, next week,
yes.
I'm going all electric, by the way.
You are, I noticed that. I noticed this morning a little sort of light buzzing on you.
I'm also getting an electric car.
Are you?
Maybe by this time next week. I've been waiting weeks and weeks and weeks for Volvo to deliver the car that I've already paid for in full. Not that I'm bitter about it. But
I think I'm beginning to detect why we're doing this subject next week.
No, well, we're not here. Next week, we're going to talk about the slow delivery times by Volvo. No, we're going to talk about electric cars generally.
Indeed.
And I feel like, so I've gone down that road because there's been there's quite
gone down that road in an electric car because
there's quite a tax incentive to do it right now.
Sure,
so the government is pushing you to buy electric. If you're running your own business, or if you're running a business, you can get it as a salary sacrifice, and you only pay 2% in-kind benefit.
Well, but you've got to charge it.
Yeah.
It doesn't go that far even on a single charge.
Yeah.
And
it's getting better though, but there is definitely, I think, more demand than there is supply as well. So, and then, there is going to be demand for more. If there are a lot more people, there's going to be demand for more charge points around the country, and they are moving. They're being put out very, very slowly.
And the price of these cars is going to come down radically because the Chinese are going to start flooding the market, as they have already and begun to in America, with cars that are much cheaper than the alternatives, because cost is what's put a lot of people off.
Yeah. But in America, of course, they're talking about, if the next president is Donald Trump, he's saying 100% tariff. So in other words, he wants to double the cost of all their imports. And he's pointing to the fact that China's trying to build a car plant in Mexico and says they're going to have 100% tariff as well.
And these electric cars are going to send all our data back to China as well.
Obviously, that's going to happen, isn't it? So, I'm going to be driving a Volvo. That's made in China as well.
Is it?
So, yeah.
Oh, right. So all Phil's data will be there.
All roads lead back to China,
which is important, I'm sure. But yes, so what about electric cars? Are they catching up with everything else?
Yeah.
Or is it going to be a long time before most people have them?
And is China going to dominate production? Because China is now making more cars than Japan. What is it going to do to the geopolitical shift that's going to come from it? There's many different questions that are going to be built around this whole question.
So what is the road for electric cars?
Like that. I feel like I shouldn't say anything at all now. We should just all quietly go off. The master at work. We'll see you next week. That's the Why Curve for this week. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
The Why Curve.